going to be speaking about two different sites today on behalf of the Scaife Trust. So we're based up in Scotland, and our remit is the archaeology of Scotland's coast, particularly where it's threatened by erosion and other coastal processes. Now, public involvement is at the heart of how we work, and volunteers are central to many of our projects, including the two I'm speaking about today. So we have a natural overlap with the Nautical Archaeology Society, and we've worked together on many projects over the years, particularly on intertidal sites and on boat graveyards. And those are two of which I'm going to be speaking about today. They're very different sites and different in character. They're on opposite coasts of Scotland, but they illustrate some of the same themes of fishing boat heritage and how sites of abandoned boats sort of reflect some of the wider changes and challenges going on across society and how local communities have responded to them in the past. So I'm going to be speaking on behalf of large project teams today for both sites, including my colleague Joe from Scaife in the top left corner there, and Steve from the Nautical Archaeology Society in the top right, but also importantly on behalf of volunteers who were involved in both projects. So first off is Findhorn Bay. This is a boat graveyard that tells the story of traditional fishing communities on the northeast coast of Scotland on the Moray coast. So this is a collection of wooden fishing boats, probably about 30 in total. We've got 14 definite sets of boat remains and a further 16 ballast mounts, which are probably from wooden vessels which have now fallen apart, with the timber elements either disintegrated or buried in the sand beneath that stone ballast. So on the left you can see the site survey, and on the right an ortho photo taken from a three-dimensional structure for motion model, which you can see is overlapping drone photos by Edward Martin. So to record the site, we did a total station survey, we did that drone survey, as well as detailed drawing, photography and written records of some of the best preserved examples of these vessels. So just to do a little bit of history, fishing was a very traditional livelihood for coastal communities all along the Moray coast. Originally whitefish, which were caught using lines, as well as salmon along the rivers. The herring fishery developed through the 17th and 18th centuries and sort of became incorporated into that and grew to be the main economic focus for the coast. Certainly by the later 19th century, herring, of course, was a massive part of Scotland's economy, with a significant export to the continent where it fed some of the growing industrial cities around the Baltic. So herring was a lucrative but very sort of volatile and unpredictable source of income. And of course, it wasn't just the fishing crews themselves, but there was a wide support network of shore-based roles that supported as well. Really throughout the 19th century, fishing developed into an almost year-round activity. There were very long seasons at sea as the boats followed the herring around Britain. Throughout the period, boats were increasing in size and sort of technological complexity really as the herring seasons grew. But that was due partly to the Washington Report to Parliament in 1849, which was produced in response to the loss of life from open boat decks, and that led to the introduction of larger, more specialised deck vessels. So the details of the fleets and the fishery are contained in the annual reports of the Fishing Board for Scotland. They've got information about vessels, the workforce, and productivity. So from 1874, they divide the boats into three size classes. First class boats with keels of 30 feet open and more in length were the vessels that were predominantly the first class boats that formed the core of the herring fleet. They were using nets, while the smaller second, third class boats were fishing normally with lines for whitefish. Throughout the period, as I've said, larger specialised sailing drifters developed, including the Fife and the Scafie, were two of the distinctive vessel styles. As the vessels increased in size, from 1894, the first class category was subdivided into two subcategories, with a second larger size class for vessels of 45 feet and over in keel length. So the Zulu was a new and innovative design which was first introduced on the Moray coast in 1879. It was a hybrid which combined elements of the two previous sort of forms of boat. It had the straight stem, the Fife, and the very raked stern of the Scafie. It was a very fast and manoeuvrable vessel. It got the catch to market quickly. It was a very specialised boat and was very successful, and it really sort of represented the sort of pinnacle of sailing drifters, and very rapidly, because it was just so huge, it came to dominate the herring fleet by the end of the century. Auxiliary steam power capstans were introduced to handle the nets from about 1884, and then steam propulsion came in the early 20th century. So at the time of the Zulu, the crews really owned the shares in the boats, and the organisation of the trade was run by shore-based curers. They retained boats using an engagement system with a fixed price per cran landed. But as I've said, herring was a very sort of volatile source of income. There was a glut on the market in 1884, and that led to a move away from the engagement system into a sale by auction system. But there were also some very bad years around the turn of the century, just due to the sort of migration of the herring, and that was actually devastating for some of the crews. So it was very much a sort of boom and bust industry for people. So at Findhorn, what we've got, almost all of the vessels where they're identifiable are Zulus. They probably all are Zulus. All the surviving evidence we have is consistent with that. And they all appear to be first class in size. All of those that are intact enough to indicate their original size are first class. Of the larger subcategory, 45 feet keels or longer. Some of them have boilers for steam capstans, but there's no evidence of conversion to steam propulsion at all. If I just zoom in on this Archaeology photo, you can see some of the fantastic detail that Eddie was able to capture in his drone imagery. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of some of the best preserved examples on the ground. So this one in particular, you can see we've got that very distinctive Zulu rigged stern post surviving and a large area of carvel planking under the ballast. Again, in this example, we've got quite a lot of the planking. We've got the full length of the keel. We've got frames as well as the detached stern post and rudder. Three of the best preserved examples are actually in a small sandbar in the middle of the channel. They survived really up to deck level. We've got all the surviving details there, including that steam boiler and the firebox as well. But I just want to draw particular attention to one anomalous example. So this is a first-class vessel. We think the keel's buried, but the scattered elements and the visible elements suggest that it was a first-class size, which would suggest it was a later vessel. But the surviving patch of planking and the notched frames indicate that it was clinker built. So you've got something of an anomaly here. Clinker seems to be superseded in the 1870s and 1880s for larger boats, but this boat from its length looks to be much later than that. So oddly, this seems to be too big and too late to be clinker. We can't really understand this boat, but according to the historic sources we have for Zulus, it simply shouldn't exist. So doing some historical research in the local community, we know that in the late 19th and early 20th century, Findhorn Bay was used as a winter haul-out for Zulus. This photo, you can see we've got the Zulus all BF registered, which means they were from the Banff and Buckie district, are visible on the shore where we came across them at Findhorn Bay. Unfortunately, the only visible registration, this one here, is the Maggie Smith of Port Essay, but none of the other registration marks are visible. So we know that Findhorn Bay was used as a safe haven in the winter and at times of storminess, really reflecting the lack of suitable harbours for the big drifters along the Murray coast. And there was actually a report in the Forest Gazette of on the 18th of February 1914, which recorded high tides accompanied by a strong westerly gale, which caused significant damage to the vessels in Findhorn Bay and stated that they were driven from their winter shelter on the Binsness shore opposite Findhorn Bay and cast adrift. So all of this is telling us that this was the winter storage area for the fleets, the herring fleet of the Murray coast. Looking into the archival information about the herring fleet here, the annual reports showed that the composition of first-class boats, really from the point the larger subcategory of first-class vessels was introduced, the new bigger boats were being very much embraced by the local fishing crews, and they were replacing the earlier smaller vessels. So there seems to be a lot of investment in the fishermen and the crews and the opportunities of the new bigger boats that were being introduced. So the vessels in Findhorn are of that size. On average, they're about 56 feet in length on the keels, all of which suggest that they are quite late in build, sort of right up into the late 19th, early 20th century, at a time when the vessels being produced were increasing in size, really just before they were being superseded by steam. So we think the examples we have at Findhorn are probably the largest and latest Zulus to have been built. So it seems that at the point when they were dumped, they were probably still quite new with long working lives ahead of them when steam was introduced and outcompeted them, because you can see that shift from sail to steam reflected in the outputs of the local boatyards in the early 20th century. You can see here in 1914, up to that point, it's all been Zulus, and then suddenly in 1904, there's a complete and sudden shift from Zulus to steam drifters. One of the issues was that Zulus, with their very specialised shape and lines, that draped stern, really made them very unsuitable for conversion to steam. So there's never much in the way of retrofitting of steam power to the wooden sailing drifters. And likewise, if you look at the contribution of different vessels to the catch in the decade prior to the outbreak of the First World War, you can see that steam really grew to completely overwhelm the contribution of sail by 1913, with motorised boats making a contribution as well. And that again is reflected in the local newspapers. If you look at the small ads of the Banffshire Advertiser, there's a glut of herring boats on the market, all of which are for sale at really knockdown prices, some of which are on the market for months and months at a time without shifting. So essentially, these vessels were rendered obsolete very rapidly. The Fishery Board reports for the period, they also reflect the workforce who are working the herring fishing. You can see the number of fishermen is maintained, in the same as we saw earlier, that the number of boats working the herring carried on working at the same numbers. But these reports also show the employment figures for the busiest weeks in each district. And what that shows is that in that decade, up to the beginning of the First World War, there is a decline in the activity of the Moray fishing ports. So there is something a little bit different going on. And if you look at the productivity, the number of barrels being produced by the districts, that falls off during the same period. So we've got a drop in production and a drop in activity through that first decade of the 20th century. Although there are possibly hints of a recovery in some areas in the couple of years immediately prior to the First World War. But that's very much in contrast to the booming picture of the national fishery. So Scotland is really producing lots of herring right up to the outbreak of war. But that really masks the local story if you only look at the national picture. But we also have evidence of the decline of the local herring fleets, specifically at Findhorn, because we've got a series of local family photos which have been dated to the summer of 1913. And these show the Zulus hauled up where we saw them earlier, but instead of being sort of ranked neatly, they're looking quite haphazard. And if you sort of zoom in, they are in a state of disrepair. So this has been dated to summer of 1913 through the identification of the individual children in the photos, and also the fact, quite simply, what they're wearing. This is Scotland. You do not dress like that on the beach unless it's high summer. So all of that showing that these vessels aren't joining the herring in the summer, which was peak herring season. So the boats are not joining fishing that year. So it looks like they're already starting to drop out of the fishing activity. So we seem to have this background of increasing vessel size, changing fleet composition, and the adoption of the new bigger Zulus by the local crews. But when you get that introduction of steam, you've got the sudden obsolescence of sail, a collapsing demand for the redundant boats, and you're starting to see these vessels become abandoned at Findhorn Bay even before the outbreak of the First World War. So what simply seems to have happened is that they were left at the winter haven and just never taken out again. So we've got sort of gradual formation of abandoned boats here, rather than a complete and deliberate discard at the start of the war. The boats that were dumped in 1914 would have joined vessels that were probably already there. And then, of course, post-war, with the loss of the export markets to the continent, the completely changed world, these vessels were simply never returned to. So you've really got sort of Findhorn Bay and the boat graveyard here reflecting that sort of global change, both of the First World War, but also of the changing market of fishing boats and the move from sail to steam and then motor power. The thing about these examples, these Zulus at Findhorn Bay, they are very rare. There's vanishingly few of these boats that once formed a fleet of tens of thousands all over Scotland. So they're quite significant, not only for their rarity, but also because they represent that sort of turning point in the herring industry, at that shift from sail to steam power, and the decline of commercial fishing that took place within the smaller traditional vernacular harbours around Scotland, as fishing became concentrated in a few much larger industrialised fishing ports, as the introduction of steam vessels needed larger, deeper ports with access to infrastructure. So Findhorn really does represent the end of the age of sail, the introduction of steam propulsion, and in reflection of its importance and all the different elements of the story it tells, it's designated as a scheduled ancient monument by Historic Scotland just this summer 2020, just reflecting its overall importance. So to move on now to our second site, this is on the opposite coast, down in Archaeology Bay in Solway Firth, but it does illustrate some of the same themes as we're seeing at Findhorn Bay. So there's a collection of features on the shore here opposite Kirkcudbright, which are actually visible on the Google aerial images if you zoom in on the banks right opposite. So we've got a Second World War swifter there, a small launch, a fish trap, but we also have a larger wooden trawler on the riverbank there. So it was first recorded simply as an abandoned boat in a coastal survey of 1996. We first visited it in 2015 when it was identified as having a number of quite interesting and distinctive features that caught our attention, but actually turned out to be far more interesting and more unusual than we'd anticipated when we first started looking at it. So I'm going to be covering some of the most striking, diagnostic and intriguing features of the boat and of the history we've learned about it so far. So again, this was a volunteer survey. We looked in detail at the vessel, made detailed drawings and sketches as well as written records. And again, we did a drone survey because this is really quite three-dimensional, so getting that overhead view was really useful. And we created a 3D model from the drone and the ground photos, which is available on the Sketchfab platform, with some of the main distinctive features highlighted, so you can explore the site virtually for yourself. So it's an interesting and quite unusual example, we think, of a wet well trawler. And as you can see from the images, again, this is a very fragile and deteriorating vessel. So Nick Coombe of the Solway Firth Partnership, who was one of the partners in this project, he spoke to the local community members before we started our fieldwork. And several people in Kirkcudbright who remembered the boat identified it as the Fauna. David Collin, who's a local resident and local historian, had a lot of information, including these photos. And he recalled that the Fauna was originally a Belgian eel fishing vessel, which worked out of Fleetwood and was fishing for sole in the Solway Firth in the 1970s. He was even able to identify the captain by name, said Joe Kennedy. He recalled that Fauna was in Kirkcudbright and was involved in an incident when it was in harbour, when it was caught between the quayside and a larger vessel, was squeezed and the hull was damaged. So you remember that it was then laid up at the pier, as you can see in these historic photos, and had sat abandoned at the jetty here for a number of years around the 1970s. And you can see from the photo of the stern here, there's actually tide marks visible on the transom, so it appears to have sunk at its moorings and no longer be watertight, not be free floating with tide by the time this photo was taken. We've got photos of both the stern and of the deck structure there. He recalled that it was more or less intact, but was eventually found to be just an obstruction to the working harbour. So it was taken away, removed, and then finally abandoned, where we came to record it at the hill on the opposite bank of the river. Quite simply, we think this was apparently in use again as an established boat graveyard. This was out of the way of the busy harbour, easy enough to take the boat away to, but far enough from the port and the channel so as not to cause an obstruction to working vessels that were still using the harbour. So the work we did identified a number of features which sort of tell the story of Fauna's working life, which seems to be particularly long and complex. Some of the interesting modifications it's undergone through its life, and let's piece together some of the story of Fauna's history. So first off, just looking at its form, that gives us some hints about its function, possibly its origins. The hull is quite distorted and twisted as it's deteriorated, but it does have quite a broad, sort of shallow, beamy shape originally. And although the keel is buried and we're only seeing the port side of the hull, it does not appear to have been deeply keeled. So this would not have been a vessel that was sitting in deep water. It wasn't sort of seagoing going far offshore. So we think it was a sort of broad, shallow drafted vessel working sort of estuarine coastal waters rather than deep sea fishing. And I'm afraid my presentation seems to have stuck at that point. There we go. We also have an interesting pattern of holes in the planking beneath the waterline in the midship section have been carefully bored in specific patterns, different sizes and different patterns of holes in the planking beneath the waterline where it's visible on the port side. And some of those holes still have the wooden plugs that have been carefully and deliberately inserted to make that section watertight again. So we've got this interesting picture of a free-flooding central section that's then been deliberately, painstakingly plugged and made watertight again. We've also got some interesting features of the framing on the port side where it survives. We've got double frames and paired frames at the bow and at the stern, but single double-spaced frames in the midship section. Now, this is apparently a particular feature of Dutch-built vessels, which would suggest that, which would support that suggestion of a Low Countries origin for fauna. The hull itself is divided by watertight bulkheads, so these are just larger raised floor timbers which come up to the waterline across the midship section, dividing the middle part of the hull into 3 watertight compartments. And those coincide with the change in the framing and with the hold planking that we saw earlier. In front of the forward watertight bulkhead, we've got a mast step sitting on top of the keelson. The mast step itself has now been infilled, but apparently Fauna was originally a sail-propelled vessel. Again, supporting that, we've got iron fittings and the remains of chain plates for sails attached both to the port bulwark and to the collapsed timbers on the starboard side. So those would have been fittings, we think, for shrouds to the hull, again supporting the suggestion that Fauna was originally sail-powered. So we did this sort of schematic drawing showing some of the key diagnostic features. And you can see, as we've said, it appears to be built for shallow seas with a very solid, robustly built bow and stern, but a much lighter midship section with those 3 free-flooding compartments of the pierced strakes in the middle, which were separated by watertight bulkheads into 3 compartments. So it seems to be a specially constructed vessel with a very specific purpose. And looking at comparisons, we think it was probably a continental wet well fishing boat. These are the lines of a similar one that we were able to come across. This is a Breton lobster boat. It's slightly different because it was built for open seas, so we're deeply keeled. If we add the water line, you can see we've got that free-flooding wet well tank in the midship section, which was keeping the catch alive at sea. So these were mostly used for shellfish fishing. And this is a composite image put together by Steve, which sort of suggests the lines of how Fauna might have looked originally when it was still sail-powered. However, it does appear to remain tiller steered throughout its working life, right up to the 1970s, because if you zoom in on that photo of it when it was at rest in Findhorn, and you can see that offset gap between the rudder and the transom. So just want you to note that. So I'll come back to that in a minute. So this is the closest example we could find of a photo of how it might have looked originally. Again, this is a photo found by Steve of a continental wet well sailing trawler. So we think that its function would have been trawling for oysters, because from the late 18th century, oysters were a staple food. They were exported in millions, really as a very key foodstuff. And young oysters were harvested and then used to seed commercial oyster beds. So for that purpose, of course, it was very important to keep the catch fresh and alive at sea, hence the function of the wet well. So Fauna seems to have been one of these very specialised wet well vessels working in oyster harvesting. As far as we know, it's a unique surviving example of this. There's no known comparisons as far as we know. So please get in touch if you know of any others. Again, here at Fauna, we've got evidence of the redundancy of sail because there's evidence that there's been a motor retrofitted to the hull. So we've got engine bearers and a fuel tank here at the stern end. So internally, we've got engine beds and modification at the inside of the stern, showing at least 2 phases of inserted engines here. And externally as well, you can see there's definitive proof that Fauna was propeller driven later in its life. So this is the sort of engine that we think might have been initially retrofitted. It would have been bolted onto those wooden engine beds that you can see sitting on top of the frames inside the hull. So we've got timber beds for the engine bearers, but we then also have at least 2 sets of steel mounts as well. So you can see there's been multiple engines fitted. And this is probably the sort of larger engine that was fitted later. So as they inserted these bigger engines, there were more damage done, which necessitated further modification around the stern end. If you look in detail around that, you can see the aft-most frames have been cut almost all the way through to accommodate the propeller shaft and the stern gland, and then to compensate for that, there's been packing timbers and even concrete poured around the stern posts just to sort of strengthen the structure around the stern. And again, those aftermost watertight bulkheads that contain the flooding wet well, they've been cut down to accommodate the overhanging front face of the larger and longer engines. So the insertion of that engine may have coincided with watertight plugging of the wet well holes. So this may have been when Fauna changed into just a conventional trawler. And again, on the outside, you can see evidence of modification of the stern post. You've got the sterns being cut quite far back, and you've had inserted timbers to compensate for that. The rudder had to be offset to accommodate the propeller. So you can see the keel gudgeons being moved aft on that triangular extension to give space for the propeller. And then in this photo from 2006, these features are now gone, but you can see them on this earlier photo. You can see this hanging timber, and that was what held the rudder back off the transom, which accounted for that gap that we saw in the 1970s photo. It's now been detached and lost, but fortunately Duncan McNeil took this wonderful photo a few years ago, but it's still in situ more or less. And you can also see the cutout in the leading edge of the rudder, which gave space for the propeller. So looking again into the sort of composition of the fishing fleet around the early 20th century, you can see a decline in the second class sailing vessel serving and a corresponding increase in the number of motor vessels that were registered. Those are actually often the same boats that have just had a motor retrofitted. So here at the Fauna, we're seeing a different aspect of that shift from sail to motor power in second class vessels around the period of the start of the First World War and through the following decades. We've got that period of massive change, which was when Fauna probably lost its mast and had the engine fitted, just reflecting a sort of different response to the change in maritime technology of the time. We also have evidence of later repairs. We've got this extremely bad practice of concrete ballast that's been poured into the hull. That's probably to compensate for the extra weight of the larger engines that would probably caused some damage to the hull when it was done. We've got other questions that have come up from the vessel as well. So we've got evidence of metal sheeting around the bow, possibly we think for protection from when the anchor was taken in over the side, or possibly for pulling in fishing equipment. There's been a suggestion it might have been for ice breaking on the continent. And certainly around the stem, we've got that steel shoe. So we're thinking possibly some sort of armouring or even repair of worn out timbers around the bow. But also further back, so this is on the port side, we've got evidence of iron staining further along the hull. We don't know if that was also on the starboard side, of course, because that's been lost. But obviously that metal armouring continued further back as well. And we have these tiny, tiny timber pins on the stem post itself underneath that steel shoe. We don't know why, but the function of them is completely unknown, but we think possibly for some sort of softwood cladding around the bow. So again, if you've got any ideas, please do get in touch. We've got evidence of later repairs of the planking. These examples here are just very crude scaffolding planks. We think they might have just been put on to allow the hull to be floated from Kirkcudbright to its final dumping place at Gabe Hill, so just enough to make it watertight, long enough to take it across the river, perhaps to be floated away to this boat graveyard at Gabe Hill. But you'll notice here, we also have these odd rectangular cutouts on the line of the frames in the midship section around the wet well section of the hull. So some of them have been plugged, but some in some cases that plug has now been lost. And you can see it's been cut all the way through the depth of the planking through to the frames. Seems to be part of the original construction, but again, unknown purpose. We don't know the function of these holes, so any ideas, please do get in touch. So what we do know about the vessel is that it appears to be European in origin, continental, Belgian, Dutch, or Danish possibly. It seems to have worked in sort of shallow coastal estuarine waters, originally with that wet well, so probably working as a specialist vessel in the oyster fisheries, originally sail-powered. That was rendered redundant during the First World War, which is when the engine was first retrofitted. Around the same time, it was converted to a conventional vessel, but there are still a lot of mysteries about Fauna. There's a lot of questions still to answer, including when and how it first came to be in the UK. The timing suggests potentially that it may be tied up with the influx of Belgian refugees who came to Britain during the First World War, following the rape of Belgium by invading German troops in 1914, because there are records that 250,000 refugees arrived in 1914, and they are said to have fled in anything that could float. So was Fauna one of these vessels? Certainly there's a memorial in London showing the gratitude of the nation of Belgium to the UK. So is Fauna part of this story? Certainly we know that the continental oyster fishery suffered very badly during the First World War. It struggled to recover through the 20s and 30s, but through the Second World War it went into terminal decline. Although there was a similar movement in the 1930s, 1940s, during the Second World War, there were further boats abandoned then, but most of them were either destroyed or converted, hence the real rarity of the Fauna as a surviving example of that type of vessel. Anyway, whatever, we know that ultimately it came to rest in Kirkcudbright after having fished here locally around Solway from the Fleetwood coast. There are stories locally of either an engine failure or that damage to the hull in the accident, which involved a larger boat at the quayside in Kirkcudbright. It was deemed to be beyond economic repair. As you can see from this photo, it then sunk at the jetty on the mud before finally being refloated towards Gabe Hill for abandonment. And that's probably when those scaffolding planks were inserted onto the hull, just to render it watertight enough to get it across the river. However, by the time this happened, Fauna was probably at least 60 or more years old by this point, and it had a long history of modification, adaptation, and some maladaptation as well, which would have compromised and damaged the vessel and the hull by that date. So it really had reached the end of a long working life by that point before it was dumped at Gabe Hill, probably about 50 years ago. And really, for the first 40 years, it seems to have held together remarkably well. So I've already shown you photos from 1995 and 2006, and you can see that all the way up to 2010, in this photo that was shared by David Collin, it was very much holding its shape. It's still quite recognisable from the photos from the 1970s. But by the time we first visited in 2015, it was really starting to deteriorate and was in really quite bad condition. by the time we actually did our survey in 2019. And most recently, it was recorded in August 2020. There's a television crew down there who shared this photo, and you can see there's this very visible and sudden deterioration in its condition. The bow is now almost completely gone. So we really were there sort of just in time. This really does illustrate the urgency of recording these intertidal vessels. So we've got, I think, all we can from the physical remains, but there is further work needed to piece together some of the history. So I'd like to end speaking about the fauna just on an appeal for input, suggestions, and more information. That there's a lot of expertise in the audience, so if anyone can suggest anything, we'd be very grateful. It'd be great to do more research in the local archives in Lancaster to help perhaps chase down some of its later use, in which we could work back from there to its original origins. So I just want to finish by thinking about these two different sites, Findhorn Bay and the Fauna at Fauna, thinking about how they both reflect the world at the early 20th century of changing maritime technology, the end of the age of sail, the different responses by different vessels and by different communities, and the ways in which those changes and the impacts on vessels and on fisheries are really reflected in some of these boat graveyard sites. But these intertidal boat graveyards, they're often overlooked, I think, but they can give real insights into some of these stories. Whether it's the sort of changing economy of the period, some of the changes in the natural environment to do with fisheries, and some of the global changes such as the First and Second World Wars, and how these sites then reflect the decisions of the communities and the owners of these vessels to convert or not to convert, as with the Zulus compared to the fauna. So these sites, they really are ways into some of these stories, and I think that's one of the things is we do need to look particularly at these intertidal sites because they are particularly vulnerable. You know, it's great that Findhorn has been recognised by scheduling now, but as illustrated by the sudden and very dramatic deterioration of the fauna, these natural processes can be sudden and dramatic once a tipping point in their condition has been reached. And I think there's a real urgency to learn what we can from them before they completely disappear. So I'd just like to finish off by thinking about the sort of positivity of the scheduling and highlighting the urgency of the issue, and finish just with a thanks to everyone who contributed, particularly volunteers, and highlight a special thank you and recognition of the contribution of Joni Guest of the North of Scotland Archaeology Society. She was involved in several of our collaborative projects, and she was really one of the champions of these boat graveyard sites, and it was largely thanks to her drive and enthusiasm that brought our attention to them and ensured that their stories were recorded and saved and are now being communicated before the sites are lost. So I'd just like to finish with a special thank you and in grateful memory of Joni and her contribution to the coastal maritime archaeology of Scotland. Thank you.